Fill to Capacity, where heart, grit, and irreverent humor collide. A podcast for people too stubborn to quit and too creative not to make a difference. Hi, I'm Pat Benincasa, and welcome to Fill to Capacity, episode 97, a dialogue across time and absence. I'm excited to welcome my guest, Aidan Ryan, a writer, publisher, filmmaker, and literary curator in residence at Art Park. Oh, for those of you who may not know, Art Park is a 150-acre cultural hub in Lewiston, New York, where outdoor performances, creative residencies, and dynamic visual art exhibitions happen against the stunning backdrop of Niagara River Gorge. Now, Aidan is from Buffalo, New York, grew up in a tight-knit family. And listeners, it's not every day you hear about a kid who grows up with a loving, playful aunt and uncle who were major players in the 1980s, 90s New York and international art scene. His aunt, Cindy Suffoletto, and uncle, Andy Topolski, forged a powerful legacy that began in Buffalo's raw, experimental 1970s art scene before they ventured to New York City. Now, in his upcoming book, I Am Here, You Are Not, I Love You, Aidan retraces their journey, showing how they overcame obstacles, reinvented themselves, leaving a lasting impact on their personal lives and the art world. But even as their influence grew, time had its own plans. Both passed away unexpectedly. Andy in 2008 at the age of 56, and Cindy in 2012 at the age of 50. Now, Aidan was kind enough to send me his book before its release, and I have to say, it caught me completely by surprise. As an artist who came of age in that era, bouncing between Minneapolis studio and gallery scene and trips to New York for new shows, I have to tell you, reading it felt like time traveling into that unforgettable world. So with all that, welcome, Aidan. So nice to have you here.
Thanks so much, Pat. That was a wonderful introduction. Yeah, I'm so excited for this conversation.
I want to start at the beginning. Aidan, who are you? What do your parents do? Do you have siblings? What's your story?
Yeah, gosh. Well, you said I'm from Buffalo. I've lived in Buffalo most of my life. There have just been a couple stints away, but the city does have a way of pulling you back in. I grew up in the north part of the city. Both of my parents are educators. My dad works at the University of Buffalo and did for most of my life. And my mom is an administrator in special needs school. And my sister's an educator as well, actually. Talia is an artist and an art teacher at a middle school locally.
And where did you go to college?
Yes. So I did my undergrad here in Buffalo at Canisius, and then I did a master's degree in U.S. literature in the University of Edinburgh in Scotland.
So your book, I Am Here, You Are Not, I Love You, is about your aunt Cindy Suffoletto and your uncle Andy Topolski. Now, Cindy is your mom's sister, and with a name like Suffoletto, look, Aidan, I'm a first-generation Italian-American, okay? With a name like Suffoletto, I have questions. Tell us about your mom's family. What part of Italy are they from, and who in that line immigrated to the U.S., and why Buffalo?
They're great questions, and I wish I knew a little bit more. I've done more genealogical research on my dad's side, and actually largely because my dad's sister, Shelley Bewley, has done most of that work, the foundational work. I was actually able to go back to Ireland and find the hut where the Ryans came from, and I haven't done that kind of work.
Excuse me, is that your dad?
That's my dad's side.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. So that was wonderful. I haven't done that kind of work yet on my mom's side, the Italian side, but I hope to in the coming years. So my mom's last name is Suffoletto, and her mother's maiden name was Donnarumma. The Suffolettos, Donnarumas, and Minellas, that's the next in the matrilineal line, all came from, but generally the middle of Italy. I believe the Suffolettos are from Abruzia, and the Donnarumas are from a little town called Episcopio, which is near Naples.
I got to ask, growing up in an Irish-Italian family, what was that like growing up?
It was great. I think actually it's a relatively common mix in Buffalo, just because of the patterns of immigration into this city. A lot of people I know are both Irish and Italian. But it was wonderful, great food, great traditions, a lot of fun, and really just strong family ties on both sides.
You are a writer, publisher, filmmaker, and curator. What is your main form of expression?
Oh, definitely writing. Yeah. I feel like I wanted to be a writer, whatever that meant, at a pretty young age. I mean, I was a reader all my life. And that was a big part of like who I was, growing up, how I thought of myself. But the writing thing really turned on around fifth or sixth grade. And I realized it was just fun. I was writing like poems or, like sort of like insult diss tracks or whatever, making fun of friends of mine in verse. And then, from there, stories and things like that. And really ever since then, it's just been a part of who I am. Filmmaking was a much more recent experiment.
Did Cindy or Andy influence your choice to be a writer?
I think in subtle ways. They knew that this was something I was interested in, and Cindy in particular, because the last 4 years of her life, I was really dialing into that. This would be late high school and early college for me, and it was something she and I talked about. And then she was certainly encouraging of my interests in that way. I think their influence on me, though, was somewhat less direct. I was interested in what they were interested in. And that pushed me toward writing about different things, reading about different things. It sort of informed the backdrop more so than, hey, you should be a writer, right?
Yeah. Now, before we go any further, we're going to be talking about the art world. And for those listeners not familiar with the art world, what does it look like and how does it shape the lives of those who live and work in it?
That's a huge question.
I know.
And I feel like you could teach me quite a bit here. Look, this book, I hope resonates with people broadly, because Cindy and Andy represent a kind of experience of a life in the arts that is not the most glamorous one. It's not the one that is most often in documentaries and books and so forth. We're familiar with the concept of like a struggling artist, but I don't think that this, an artist who never quite breaks through is into canonization is the one that we typically memorialize in books and documentaries like this. I think a life in the arts can be incredibly enriching, especially in a time when I think we're living through a kind of crisis of meaning, as a species right now, and having some kind of artistic practice in your life can be a bulwark against that. But it also requires often big sacrifices, especially if you have your mind set on some kind of idea of commercial success, whether that means that you want only to make money from your art, not to have a 9-to-5 job that you have to clock into, or it means you want some kind of recognition. And, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think any of us would put anything into the world if we didn't want that recognition. But if those are the markers, if those are the objectives, then there are going to be huge sacrifices, whether that be financially or in terms of relationships or otherwise.
Yeah. And I can say growing up in the 70s, getting an MFA and an MA and studying art, the standard in the 70s, like studying to be an artist, was if you weren't in New York, you weren't anywhere. If you didn't achieve that kind of mega wattage notoriety, nothing mattered. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, that was something to adjust to and figure out that as an artist, I can write my own scenario. But it took a few years to figure that out, that between 0 and 90, there were a lot of speeds. So I do think that what you just explained is really, it's helpful, especially to people who are not in the art world, to get a sense like, oh, okay, there are always trade-offs for your work.
Mm-hmm.
what
Yeah.
you're willing to give up. So let's go back to your book. What made you write this book? Did you have like an aha moment like, oh my God, I've got to tell their story. I've got to write this.
Yeah, there were really several steps along the way. And I think the first one was when Cindy died and my family asked me to give her eulogy. So I write about that in the book. I was coming up on the end of my freshman year in college studying creative writing. And I remember sitting down to write that and just recognizing that it was a different task than any kind of writing I'd done before. And I think that it was because it actually mattered to other people besides me, as
Yeah.
opposed to my little poems and stories and whatever. This was something that was going to have an effect on people. It was going to help people through a grieving process. And I recognized the importance of that. But then I also had this really uncanny and uncomfortable feeling after I had delivered the eulogy with everybody coming up and saying, whoa, what a good job you did. And I felt very kind of lonely in that moment because with all the praise that was heaped on me for this act, I just felt more and more that I was missing Cindy, and in fact that I had not done justice to her life and everything. So there was this increasing sense of distance. So it was a very strange feeling to grapple with. But then I sat on that for a while and did other things, focused on other projects, and in the early pandemic, this would have been about July of 2020. My now wife and I were getting away for a weekend in a barn we'd rented out by the Finger Lakes.
The Finger Lakes are a group of 12 long, narrow lakes stretching north to south in upstate New York, just south of Lake Ontario.
Both thinking about what projects to take on, like so many people, in that time. And I thought that I would write a short article or essay about Hall Walls, which was this gallery and performance collective started in Buffalo in late 1974, really took off in 75. The most notable founders were Cindy Sherman and Robert Longo, now enormous names in art. But Hall Walls was representative of really extraordinary time in Buffalo, where, even though anybody who was anybody was probably in New York, many of them were spending a lot of time in Buffalo or had emerged from Buffalo or passing through Buffalo. And this is across all artistic disciplines: music, composition, new media, visual art, writing. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. I could probably write an essay about this, about what was going on in Buffalo in 1975. And my aunt and uncle, who were right there at the moment of the spark and then left, could be kind of representative of that period. And then within probably 2 weeks, I realized this is not an article. This is way bigger. It's going to need to be a book.
So when you decided that, it's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to write an article. But when you come to the realization, I need to write a book, that's huge. That opens the door to how did you go about it? How did you even know what to do? Did you have to track down people to interview? How long did it take?
Yeah, it took quite a while, and it was unlike any other kind of writing project I'd done before. When I was in undergrad, I thought I wanted to be a novelist. I really had only written fiction. But then I did get into journalism, and so I was able to interview people. I knew how to work through public records databases, and so I acquired some of those skills. But I think of the great French writer Annie Ernaux's Nobel Prize speech, where she said, "I write to avenge my people." Which is such an interesting
Yeah.
concept. I don't quite mean the same thing she meant, of course. I don't think I could, coming from such different experiences. But as I dug into Cindy and Andy's story, I got a little bit of a chip on my shoulder on their behalf. It really just started to bother me that Andy didn't even have a Wikipedia page. I mean, he was an enormous figure. And the great art gallery administrator, curator, writer, and artist Tony Bannon, who was around at that time, told me, "Oh, well, Andy was the leading light of that whole group. He was the catalyst for the whole thing." And I said, "Well, hang on a second, Tony. What do you mean by that?" He was like, "Oh, well, Longo and Sherman, they all knew Andy was the smartest one of all of them, and he was the one with all the ideas." And I thought, well, what the heck? Why wasn't he in any of the major shows of that generation? Why isn't he in the history books? That really bothered me. And then on Cindy's side, when I discovered or really realized that she had, moved to New York at like 22, 23 years old, left her family, decided I'm going to do this thing and be a working artist, and then just suddenly stopped a few
Yeah.
years in. That also struck me as a kind of injustice. And so I thought,
Yeah.
I just need to correct the record here.
That really came through in the book. I mean, anybody reading that book really felt that. I don't think it's a chip on the shoulder, but when we discover things about people we love, our families, when
Hmm.
they've passed, we get a glimpse into their life and the recognition that they did not receive. It cries out to be addressed.
Hmm.
I see it more that way than a chip. So, Aidan, how did you use your personal connection as their nephew and godson to write their story and at the same time reveal new truths about their legacies? How did you balance that?
Yeah, well, I took a bit of a risk. I hope it paid off. I think that injecting myself into the story at times felt a little bit like I was intruding. You know what I mean? Because I set out initially to write their story, but I found there were so many gaps that I had to fill in sometimes with speculation that I just sort of entered into the story. But then also, I found that some of the things that were most compelling to me about their lives had to do with my own experiences that paralleled theirs in some way. And then also, I could write about them as artists, and that might be interesting to some people, but to write about them as people, really, there's no better perspective than my own as their nephew and godson to write the story. Somebody else who knew them could also write a memoir in this way. But, like the relationship between Buffalo and New York City, and this, yourself, this sense that it's happening in New York and you have to be there to make it is just as true in the writing world in the 2010s when I was coming up as it was in the visual art world in the 1970s. And I also felt this tug. Am I going there? Am I not? Am I going to do an undergrad there? Am I going to do an MFA there? Am I going to go live
Yeah.
there? Even up until like last year. And so I related to that part of the story. And then some of the sort of early misses in my writing career, I was able to relate to, particularly Andy's discontent at losing out on certain opportunities. So I just decided to weave those in.
So, after writing the book and uncovering their untold story, did your view of Cindy and Andy shift in ways that you hadn't expected?
Oh, I mean, enormously, yeah. In Cindy's case, I always took for granted that she was an artist. And I was, I think, in a minority there because most people I talked to who knew her in her life didn't know her in the brief periods when she was a practicing and exhibiting artist. They just knew her as an artistic person. But because we had her artwork in my parents' house and in my grandmother's house, I just knew that she was an artist, but I never thought about what that meant to her or what she wanted it to look and feel like.
Yeah.
And the enormous disparity between Andy's numerous solo shows internationally, the catalogs he was in, the books he was in, and again, he wasn't even in enough to, commensurate with his actual contributions. But the complete and abrupt break in Cindy's artistic practice that I discovered around 1993 or 4, it would have been, really just shocked me and
Yeah.
saddened me deeply. But then to see her return to an active studio practice in basically just the last maybe 4 or 5 years of her life was really, really inspiring. And it's odd because I knew about the early art and I knew about the late art because I, went to her house in Callicoon. After she passed, I helped clean it out. So I saw the artworks. I didn't realize there was a break in between. And that was really impressive that she could go 15 years without a studio, but still be thinking about art and be ready to absolutely explode with a huge series of great works at the end. That's just so impressive.
I was deeply moved by that. And when you talk about her stopping making art and then resuming, this also raises a bigger, historically prevalent question. Have things for women artists shifted, juggling their creative expression and output with other roles, or do those challenges persist?
Well, I'm probably not the person to answer that question definitively, but I'm going to guess that they persist just to some degree. I mean, in the book, I briefly compare Cindy and Andy's experience as a partnership, a couple who both are artists, to that of a generation or a generation and a half before them, the abstract expressionists or the second generation of the New York School. In that situation, you had Elaine de Kooning and Helen Frankenthaler, she's a little younger, Lee Krasner, who are working artists before they meet their husbands.
Elaine de Kooning was married to Willem de Kooning. Helen Frankenthaler married to Robert Motherwell. And Lee Krasner was married to Jackson Pollock. Each of these women carved out their own powerful artistic legacies, shaping the course of 20th century art.
And then they get married or they, get connected or whatever, partner up, and their husbands absolutely eclipse them in the views of the critics and the gallerists in the art world. And they're only able to emerge much later. In Lee Krasner's case, it had to be Jackson Pollock's death. And then, she had extra time to reemerge, on her own terms. I mentioned Helen Frankenthaler. She also had a longer runway in some ways as a, working artist on her own before that sort of picture got muddied when she was married. And Cindy had a very similar experience to these women who are a full generation older than her. So at least within that time period, I don't think terribly much changed.
Yeah. And I think even earlier, Sonia Delaunay, Gabriel Munter. To be candid with you, I taught at the College of Visual Arts here in St. Paul for 7 years. And in teaching, as you know, in art classes, you have discussions. Mm-hmm. And the discussion would come up, and I would often respectfully caution, usually female students, that get your art practice going, get your footing. But if you live or marry a male artist, you have to look at history and see what the consequences could be. And you need to know that going into it, if that's what you want to have happen. I think this overshadowing, when people think of Lee Krasner, for many years, it was the wife of Jackson Pollock. She's a hell of an artist. And so I think you're correct in saying that we can see the patterns. Have they changed today? That's a question.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm curious for your perspective on, I really struggled as I was dealing with this issue in the book to acknowledge the historical patterns and acknowledge how this played out in Andy and Cindy's lives, but also pay attention to Cindy's agency in this.
Yes.
In that she wasn't like forced into that role necessarily, and nor did Andy like intentionally sideline her. She made a series of choices. Now, she may have been socially conditioned into making those choices and environmentally conditioned into making those choices, but she took real pride in managing Andy's businesses and the financial aspect of his career and the registrar side of things. She took pride in being a confidant and consultant in the studio, even though that wasn't contributing to her own work. So I don't know if I balanced that well enough, but I'm curious if you've also thought about that with respect to your students or other examples the artwork.
First of all, as I was reading your book, it really hit me hard. That's why I say that the book really ambushed me, because it brought up the struggles of those years and the way you handled Cindy falling into supporting the family. And she was brilliant in terms of finances as well as being creative. You're right. The way you handled it, she made choices. But Aidan, that's like a minefield, I think. I'm going to speak, as a woman in that field. At that time, the cultural pressure of a woman to help her husband, I mean, those are really prevalent. They're really prevalent. And so she chose to do that. She did it very well. And as you talk about her own agency, I loved the fact that once Andy had passed, which was devastating, she made her way back to her art. Art is inside of us. It isn't, if we're encoded with that expression has to get out some way, somehow. And the fact that she returned to that place, art is our home, our dwelling. That's where we reside. And so for her to come back to it, and I saw those artworks were magnificent. It wasn't just coming back. It was like
Yeah.
full throttle with no F's to give, just who she was. And there was such an organic, beautiful quality. Well, I'm going on and on, but no, I think you handled the truth. A good journalist lets the person speak, and you let their stories speak for themselves. You butted out of it. You let the fact of her choices speak for themselves.
Mm.
But what happened when she came back to it? Oh my God, it just brought tears to my eyes. Like, yes, yes, of course, of course. So, yeah.
Wonderful.
So, can you tell us for a moment what kind of guy was Andy? Is there a favorite memory you have about him as you were growing up?
Yeah, it's a quiet one, but my favorite memory with Andy was sitting on the back porch that he built at their house in Callicoon, which was a little hamlet about 2.5 hours outside of New York, just shooting BB guns at beer cans. He, he was somebody, and I don't know how old I would have been. I mean, this is maybe I was maybe 10 or 11, and then up to 14, 15 maybe. And he was somebody that you could just kind of be quiet with. I kind of don't, I really feel somewhat robbed that I didn't have a relationship with him when I was maybe more of an interesting conversational partner. I don't know, how much he's going to get out of a 12-year-old, but we could at least just sit and be quiet together and shoot these BB guns off the back porch, or when I was much younger than that, play with the wooden like castle block set that was at my grandparents' house. I remember he was so fascinated by technologies, but even really simple technologies. And because when I was a kid, he didn't have young kids in the home, the new innovations that were coming out in kids' toys would just delight him. So I remember when somebody bought me this little handheld device of a 20 questions game. It must have had some like rudimentary AI or something. This is late 90s maybe, or very early 2000s, but it would play the familiar game 20 questions, and opening with is this a animal, mineral, vegetable, whatever. And somebody got this for me for Christmas. He was there. He couldn't put it down for the rest of the night. He was just blown away at this technology. And at the time, I just thought, oh, that's funny. That's Uncle Andy. He's obsessive like that. But now I connect it to the way he related to any new thing that he incorporated into his artistic practice.
Yeah.
This new way of making paper, this new way of sandblasting glass. He would go all in for 48 hours, and then it would be in his art. So I don't know that my 20 questions game ever made it into his artwork, but that was his quality of attention.
Oh, that's a delightful memory. Now, in reading your book, Buffalo, New York is more than a backdrop. It is a living character. So I have to ask you, in what ways has the spirit or history of Buffalo forged your sense of identity and belonging?
Oh, I have a tortured relationship with Buffalo, as I believe did Andy and Cindy. And maybe that's a common Rust Belt experience. So I actually have an aunt and uncle and cousins in Minneapolis. So I was out that way quite a lot growing up. And I feel like the Great Lakes and the Rust Belt in general have a sort of, united they're a cultural zone, right? Buffalo is an incredibly rich place visually and culturally to grow up, because we have absolutely amazing examples of architecture from all these different eras. It's not like, oh, Buffalo is a great like mid-century modern city. It's we've got tons of different examples, and just there are moments when I'm downtown and I look up and see like 7 different like excellent examples of architectural styles, all within the same frame of view. That's the thing about Buffalo. The extraordinary weather off the lake. I mean, there's a chapter in Moby Dick where Melville writes about the Great Lakes as equal, if not greater than any ocean. And he talks about Buffalo and Cleveland, and the drama of the weather here is extraordinary. And then there's also this inherent sense of possibility here, because everybody is just like 2 phone calls away. It's so small, and rent is cheap, and there's old unused industrial space that's available, that if you're a creative person, whether that's making visual art or just throwing a party or whatever, you can probably do it for very little money. On the flip side of things, Andy and Cindy discovered that there's a limit in real economic opportunity if you want to make a living doing creative things. And there's also Buffalo also has a relationship with mediocrity that I find really, really disappointing and troubling. I mean, we elect politicians who are just almost like comically inept, Keystone Cops level
Mm-hmm.
ineptitude. Can't balance a budget, can't fill the potholes. We do, I think, we're very quick to lionize, artists and cultural figures who maybe don't necessarily deserve it just
Yeah.
because they stuck around. There is this constant brain drain where, the top 25 most, percent of the most talented people in every field tend to leave,
Yeah.
which just lowers the, kind of the overall performance. But I love it. I can't help but love it here.
Yeah. Boy, you hit a nerve on that one about the Rust Belt cities. I'm from Pontiac, Detroit area growing
Oh,
up.
wow.
And
Yeah.
so after grad school, I left Detroit to come to Minneapolis. Just growing up around the big three automakers and all the industry, I thought once I moved to Minneapolis, I'm done. Detroit is behind me. I'm going to have a new beginning. But there's something about those cities that are etched in us. And it wasn't until I started doing my Industrial America painting series that I realized I can run anywhere, but I cannot leave that.
Hmm.
I cannot leave that. There was something so poignant about those industrial sites for me that someone once called them Rust Belt cathedrals. And there's something about that. And so I guess it brings me to the meditation or the question, why does place matter in understanding our past?
I think I may be investigating this question for the rest of my life. I feel like so much of my writing, comes down to this. I try to talk a little bit in the book about this exact question because I think, in a very literal sense, place shapes us. The way that the streets are laid out in Buffalo shapes the experience of generations growing up here. I talk about the radial form of the streets and the way
Yeah.
that that guided immigration and migration in Buffalo and where people ended up and where Cindy and Andy ended up, right? And I do think things like the drama of the weather live in us forever.
Yep.
I mean, I talk about the Irish side of my family. Certainly, when I visited Ireland in 2014, there were people who remarked, "Oh, what a beautiful summer this is. This is almost as good as the last beautiful summer we had in 1996." Like, weather lives in us. The weather in the
Yeah.
place where we came from, right? It shapes our character, the way we express ourselves.
Oh, yeah. So, how did watching your aunt and uncle transform their lives from the close knit world of Buffalo to New York's intense art scene change your view on reinvention?
In some ways, it underscored that you really do need to hang together with your people. You just can't, it's very hard to go reinvent yourself alone, especially in a place like New York. I was really struck by the way that tightly bound networks of friends work to help each other. The way Andy tipped off Peter Moscato about who was a friend and who had taken slide images of his artwork before, tipped him off about a space opening up in his building, how they were helping each other find their next place, how Charlotte Critique, who knew Andy in Buffalo, plugged him into a show in the Brooklyn Museum, how Buck, the former director of the Albright Knox, connected him with his first gallerist, Eric Siegeltuck. These people, you just, especially in a city like New York, but probably in any large, cosmopolitan city, you need your people and you need to help each other.
Yeah. So, Aidan, when is the book coming out?
May 16th.
Okay. And where will people be able to find it?
Well, you can pre-order it right now on the publisher's website, the University of Iowa Press, and I'm hoping that it will be in bookstores around the country. I don't know, I don't know exactly where yet, but probably the best place to start is the publisher's website or the
Okay.
wonderful bookshop.org. I love because they send their money back to independent bookstores.
Okay.
Great alternative to Amazon.
Also, I'll put the link beside your own website. I'll put the link to University of Iowa so folks can
Oh,
track
great.
down the
Thanks.
book. Aidan, can you share how memory turns moments of loss into paths of rediscovery, really reshaping who we are?
This is probably a central question in the book because, Going back to that feeling of loss and distance I experienced after giving Cindy's eulogy, sometimes when we repeat memories in our mind, in the theater of our minds, we can kind of wear them down. They can become threadbare. We can have this experience of people being more and more distant. And the creative act of writing the book, I actually did, I think, bring Andy and Cindy closer in some ways. In some ways, I felt the distance because I was discovering things I didn't know about them in life and that I couldn't ask them about. I mean, that came up almost at every turn. Every new thing I discovered should have been a conversation. I would have loved to know what they actually thought about this.
Yeah.
But at the same time, being forced to use all the techniques of writing I had at my disposal to recreate them in the space of the text felt like a kind of dialogue. And that I think, it's almost like creating new memories,
Yeah. As I read your book, I couldn't help but think of that lovely Rumi quote, "Goodbyes are only for those who love with their eyes, because for those who love with their heart and soul, there is no such thing as separation."
Yeah.
And to me, that was the spirit of your book. It really touched me deeply. And I want to thank you for coming on Fill to Capacity today and sharing all this wonderful information and your memories. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a real honor and a pleasure.
And so, listeners, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please tell your friends and hit subscribe. Thank you. Bye.